My name is Shahera, and I'm the director of the California Homeless Youth Project based right here in Sacramento. We're at the State Library, and our goal is to educate policymakers on the needs of homeless youth throughout the state of California. And so we do that by creating a lot of original research and writing publications on all matter of issues impacting young people who are homeless in our state. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about youth homelessness, what we know from the research, what we know from talking with young people with lived experiences of homelessness. We're going to get a little bit into the solutions, and then I'm going to be moderating the discussion with our panelists. So real quick, I just wanted to get a feel for folks in the room. How many people here work in the building? Okay, great. And then other folks are service providers who work with people experiencing homelessness? Great, okay, cool, there's a good mix. All right, so we can go to the next slide. So youth homelessness in California. So in the 2013-14 school year, California schools identified about 300,000 students experiencing homelessness at some point during that year. Nationally, about 2% of students experience homelessness. In the state of California, about 5% of students are experiencing homelessness. So that's a rate more than double that of the national average. So we have a particularly acute problem in California. When we look at the point in time count numbers, these are HUD's numbers, we identified a little over 11,000 young people, both under the age of 18 and then 18 to 24, experience homelessness on a single night in January in 2015. We also have the largest number of unsheltered young people in the country. The numbers sort of vary from year to year. They hover around 80%. The last year that we counted, about 77% of the homeless youth that we identified were unsheltered. So one thing I want to point out in talking about this research is that there's no single consistent definition of homeless youth. So different federal departments use different definitions. So when we look at that first data point, the Department of Education identifies homelessness as people who may be living doubled up out of economic necessity. So sometimes that's referred to as like couch surfing, but you're not on the lease, you don't know how long you can stay. It's not out of just cultural preference that you're living together. It's oftentimes one family in poverty who has lost their home that goes to live with another family in poverty, in really crowded substandard situations. So these are pretty precarious sort of living arrangements. That accounts for about 75 to 80% of that 300,000 number. It also identifies people who are living in hotels or motels as their primary residence, and then folks who are unsheltered, maybe sleeping outside, and people who are in emergency or transitional shelters. So that's over the course of the school year, that 300,000 number. Please stay on that one. Sorry. For the point in time count, that second piece, that's folks that are unsheltered, so they might be in tents, they might be in cars, they might be in abandoned buildings. We know that the point in time count doesn't do a great job of capturing the full number of young people experiencing homelessness. It tends to primarily identify single homeless adults who are living on the streets that might be a more visible community. So we know a lot of children and families remain hidden and invisible for a lot of survival reasons, and sometimes have other options that include some type of temporary shelter, but can be equally dangerous situations. Next slide, please. So recently, the California State University system did some research to identify how many young people in college are experiencing homelessness. I think the numbers really shocked a lot of people. They identified about 1 in 10 students having some kind of housing displacement. So again, that's using that same sort of like education definition of living doubled up or tripled up, motels, hotels. We've heard of a lot of stories of young people, and especially in a lot of college towns that are experiencing a lot of gentrification. Market rate rent is really difficult to afford, even for people who are working. And so for students, this is especially the case. And so we know of a lot of students that are sleeping, 4, 5, 6 to a room, people that are staying in the laundry room of the apartment complex, other kinds of precarious situations. One thing that we talk about a lot, the California Coalition Youth talks about a lot, is that transition-aged youth, that 18 to 25 population, while they are technically adults, they have really unique needs developmentally that require services that are more specific to their community. So sometimes this means they can tend to avoid the adult homelessness system if they aren't really served in a culturally competent way that recognizes the unique needs of them being a young adult and all the transition that comes along with that. The other thing I sort of like to demystify is that, we know that homelessness is sometimes more visible in urban areas, but that it exists in our urban, suburban, and rural areas. When we looked at the number of students experiencing homelessness, what was interesting is that we saw really high numbers in our urban areas, but we saw really high percentages in our rural counties. So 3 of the 5 counties with the highest percentage of homeless students were actually rural counties, Trinity, Lake, and Sierra. And that really stood out to me because I think that a lot of these folks, or a lot of these counties, are service deserts. So some research that we did in 2010 found that 2/3 of California's 58 counties had no programs specifically for young people experiencing homelessness. And so even though we know that places like San Francisco or LA may be more well-resourced, it's still not enough to meet the need even in our urban areas, but in our rural areas, the challenges are really great because there are not specific programs to serve this community. Next slide, please. So as the Senator mentioned, LGBTQ youth, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning youth are really overrepresented among the young people experiencing homelessness. That's true not just in California, not just in San Francisco, but it's true again in urban, suburban, rural areas and across the country. So why is that the case? Why are there more LGBT youth on the streets than their heterosexual counterparts? So we know that family rejection is a big piece of that. So about 25 to 40% of LGBT homeless youth identify being kicked out because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So that's a really big percentage. But what I also like to notice within that statistic is that that means that 60 to 75% of them are becoming homeless for the same reason a lot of other young people are becoming homeless. You know, it's economic poverty, it's inability to be able to pay rent, and then there are compounding factors around difficulty finding culturally competent services. So we've had focus groups with LGBT homeless youth, and we asked them about their experiences in trying to access services. And one of the things that I've heard a lot from young people is that when they go to LGBT-specific spaces, sometimes they feel discriminated against because of their housing or economic status if they're experiencing homelessness. And then when they go to homelessness services, sometimes they feel discriminated against because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so this can make it really complicated and difficult to find programs that truly fit their needs. And the other factor is institutionalized discrimination, within our child welfare and juvenile justice systems, and I would also add our education and employment system. So it can be difficult system-wide, I think, for this community. Next slide, please. So some of the characteristics that we see in the research, we know that these young people are really likely to report family conflict, which is often exacerbated by poverty. They're far more likely to be physically or sexually victimized than their heterosexual counterparts or than housed peers, and are likely to be victimized repeatedly. Homeless young people are 3 times as likely to be pregnant or parenting as their housed peers. We also see really high rates of depression, of post-traumatic stress disorder, of suicidality. We know that if a young person doesn't already have some sort of mental health issue before they become homeless, a lot of times just the event of homelessness is a traumatic one that can create a lot of mental health strain. And that is really exacerbated, I know, for so many young people that become homeless and then aren't able to be served by what meager supports we have available. And the trauma really compounds as their lives, either on the streets or in other precarious situations, continue. About 30 to 40% report some sort of alcohol problem within their lifetime, and about 40 to 50% report drug use. And so again, we know that a lot of these young people are self-medicating due to a lack of access to medical or mental health care. We see so much use, I think, of substances on the streets as a survival tactic. We know a lot of young people might use meth to stay up all night because they're afraid of being victimized on the streets because that's happened to them, or because they can't find a place to sleep outside, so it's not safe to try and do that, or because there are laws on the books that prevent people from sleeping outside, so they know there's no place that they can lay down without getting harassed or cited or arrested. So there are compounding sort of factors within that. These young people have difficulty finding employment, which often forces them into the street economy. And so that can look all different types of ways. One of the things that we see is sometimes exchanging sex for food, shelter, or clothing, for a place to stay. Survival sex is sometimes what that's referred to. And one of the things I want to point out is that none of these characteristics are due to deficits within the young people, but it's important to think about what ladders of opportunity they have. So these are survival tactics that young people engage in because they're resilient, and they do that when we provide them no other options. So we have to kind of turn the lens back on us to say, why do we create a culture that facilitates these types of behaviors as opposed to what's wrong with this young person that they're engaging in these behaviors? If that makes sense. Okay. Yeah, I also like to focus a little bit on resiliency. As someone who's experienced homelessness as a young person and spends a lot of time currently with young people who are experiencing homelessness, a lot of them are really bright, shiny stars with really sophisticated understandings of social justice, intersectionality. I think that their experiences outside of the mainstream a lot of times give them, a different perspective that can be hugely valuable. And I think especially when we're thinking about policy solutions or service programs, that these are young people. They have a wealth of resource in terms of information because of their lived experience that are really worth listening to. They're often very resourceful and want to connect to a community, as all people do and as all young people do. They're likely to create street families. This is true for a lot of unsheltered young people, and find safety and power in numbers. And many feel that education is a pathway out of poverty, but have really great barriers to be able to participate in their education. But when we talk to young people experiencing homelessness across California, many of them had career goals that require really extensive education to achieve. But we just know that their barriers to being successful in school when they don't have a stable place to stay are so great that it can make it really difficult. Next slide, please. So I like to include this slide, broken systems equals broken families. Because I think that when we think about homelessness, so much of the time we place the blame on the individual or the family. And I think that sometimes the research on trajectories into homelessness kind of overemphasize personal responsibility and family conflict and tend to absolve the system of responsibility. So we know that, homelessness is something that's a national crisis, and we see the numbers of people experiencing homelessness change as we see investment change and we see policy change. And so it's not usually just fluctuating numbers of people who decide they want to participate in homelessness. We see really different things happening in our communities when we make, better and worse decisions about how to allocate our funding to support people in crisis. So, when we ask a young person, why did you become homeless? No one is ever going to say because of decades of federal disinvestment in affordable housing. Yeah. And so I think it can take a while sometimes to have that systemic lens on what's going on, but we need to be able to continually do that. And then family rejection is not the only narrative that needs focus, although prevention and reunification are incredibly important when that's the case. There are resources to do that, and that's true not just for LGBT youth, but also for other young people who may have left home because of family conflicts. So some policy recommendations. These are sort of just some overarching ideas, and we'll probably get more into specifics in our discussion. But definitely prevention of homelessness by providing support for families who are struggling economically or struggling emotionally with supporting their child. We know that a lot of times when a family is experiencing homelessness and they have a teenager, that teenager will take off to find their place to stay or sort of survival strategy because the family's not able to support them. And when we talked about family conflict, again, I wanted to just underline how much resource constraints can really exacerbate family conflict. So when a family isn't able to meet, their needs for food, shelter, clothing, family conflict really gets amplified. So we can do this by investing in homeless youth programs, particularly those that are trauma-informed, have harm reduction philosophies, and really low barrier services because they're voluntary. We need to be able to build service capacity. So you remember earlier when I mentioned that 2/3 of California's counties have no programs for homeless young people? That's something that needs to change. We need to see more kind of equitable distribution across the state. We need more in every community, including our urban communities, but we definitely also need services and supports in our rural and suburban areas. Another thing I think we can do is undoing the criminalization of homelessness, which tends to particularly impact LGBT youth and youth of color. I didn't mention it earlier, but youth of color are also overrepresented within people experiencing homelessness. That's particularly true for African American and Native American young people. And then we can look at legislation with the lens of these youth who are much in need of state attention and protection. So if we're in the building or working on, a bill that impacts foster youth or strengthens their rights or supports or juvenile justice involved youth, a lot of times, what we try to do is say, homeless young people can benefit from this too. And so I think as much as we can be thinking intersectionally about youth, that will really benefit all these populations because there's so much overlap. And we want to make sure that just because this community is sort of marked by their lack of connection to systems, that they aren't missed by a lot of the progress that we make on some of these other communities. People recommendations. So we have policy recommendations. We know that kind of stuff takes time. Doing policy work, it's incredibly important. We all do it. But also, what can we do as individuals here in this room? Treating people experiencing homelessness with dignity and respect. I know I talked to one young woman who had been panhandling, and she talked about, hey, if I ask for money, even if you don't want to give it to me, you could at least just acknowledge me like a human being. And I think that we get so used to kind of ignoring people who are experiencing homelessness, and I think it makes us uncomfortable to be so confronted with such profound poverty. But what we can do to connect to our own humanity is just to acknowledge these folks and treat them with dignity. And then I think too, just challenging stereotypes in your conversations about homelessness by choice or other sort of narratives that pathologize an individual. Like, I think in California, we have this sort of mistaken idea that everyone comes to our state to be homeless because we have great weather. And that's not true, right? We know that California sort of ranks 50th in housing affordability. We have a crisis in our state. And that most homeless folks that migrate tend to migrate for the same reasons we all do, which is connections to jobs, family, and friends. So it's not just to seek services or to find a comfortable place to sleep outside. So we can kind of uphold these narratives in our conversations. All right, next slide, please. Yeah, and I think California can and should lead the way in ending youth homelessness. Right now, unfortunately, we're leading the way in the number of youth experiencing homelessness. It's incredibly embarrassing for us as a state. I think we kind of need to feel that shame and channel it into action. There are so many resources and tools to do this, including a lot of the folks here in the room. We created a publication a couple of years ago. It was the nation's first state action plan on ending youth homelessness. It's called More Than a Roof: How California Can End Youth Homelessness. So you can find that online. And you can email me or chat with me afterwards. And we're super active on Twitter. So I think that's going to wrap it up for me for right now. So thank you so much for this. And we're going to turn it over to our panel. So